Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. Now this time we're diving into the curious case of Tajikistan, a small landlocked nation with big aspirations and even bigger neighbors. It's like being the kid on the playground trying to be friends with everyone while the bullies, Russia and China, watch from the swings. Now, one thing is clear, the geopolitical landscape of Central Asia is shifting, and as this small nation tries to navigate its way through the interests of these global giants, we're reminded that even the smallest players can have the most intriguing stories. So, let's get right to it, and here's our latest report.
This year marks Emomali Rahmon's 30th year as president of Tajikistan, the only Central Asian country with unchanged leadership since the early 1990s. There have been rumors of a change, centering on Rahmon's son, Rustam, as his successor. However, internal family disputes threaten this transition. Rahmon, 71, has also faced health issues and postponed the transition due to the severity of the COVID-19 pandemic and political unrest in neighboring Kazakhstan. As history shows, transitions of power in Central Asia rarely proceed smoothly, and Tajikistan may be forced to face similar challenges in the coming future. When taking over office, any successor would have to consider President Rahmon's accomplishment during Tajikistan's 33 years of sovereignty. Key achievements include building over 2,000 kilometers of roads, implementing 1,400 national projects, and improving living standards, with poverty level going down from 83% in 1999 to 21.2% in 2023. The population grew from 5.5 million in 1991 to 10.3 million by 2024. Significant progress was also made in telecommunications, banking and industry, including a 219-fold increase in bank savings. Education saw a substantial boost, with 47 higher education institutions now serving over 220,000 students. While progress in the authoritarian state is visible, whether the country will be able to maintain that momentum is uncertain.
And now let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Tajikistan, being a former Soviet republic, has been cozying up to Russia for decades. They're in the same military club, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, and Russia's 201st military base with 7,000 troops is practically a permanent fixture in Tajikistan. Imagine having your nosy neighbor's security cameras pointing at your backyard 24/7. That is basically Tajikistan's relationship with Russia. But there's a slight hitch. Despite this long-standing relationship with Russia, Tajikistan has been flirting with the West. Yep, the country with one foot firmly in Russia's camp is now batting his eyelashes at the United States and the European Union. It's kind of like seeing your best friend on Tinder when you thought they were in a happy marriage. An uncomfortable conversation is surely to be on the horizon. In April, Tajikistan hosted anti-terrorism exercises with Russian troops. Just a few weeks later, they were having a mountain warfare exchange with the Virginia National Guard. You can almost hear the collective gasp from the Kremlin. Russia, distracted by its ongoing war in Ukraine, seems to have turned a blind eye. Or maybe they're just too busy trying to keep their own house to notice that their ally is already flirting with NATO. And then there was the Dunashbe water process in June. Now, this high-level conference, co-organized by the United Nations Development Program and the EU, saw major Western participation, but no significant Russian presence. Imagine throwing a party and not inviting your supposed best friend, but inviting all the cool kids. Ouch. But don't break out the champagne just yet, because China is eyeing this dance floor too. While the West is offering to help Tajikistan go green and save the planet, China is rolling out the red carpet with loans and infrastructure projects. They're even building the new government complex in Dushanbe. So while the West is offering a salad bar, China's setting up an all-you-can-eat buffet. And we all know which one is more tempting when you're really hungry. Tajikistan's President Emomali Rahmon recently declared that his readiness to strengthen regional cooperation and solve pressuring watering issue. Now, this might sound like a kumbaya moment, but let's not forget the backdrop: tensions with neighboring Taliban-ruled Afghanistan over water resources. Tajikistan fears that the Taliban's construction of the Qushtepa Canal could divert water from the Amudara River, which Tajikistan heavily depends on. So, what's Tajikistan's endgame here? It looks like they're trying to diversify their diplomatic and economic ties without completely alienating their old friend Russia. It's a delicate balance to strike, and one wrong move could send them tumbling. But with China stepping up its game, offering loans and infrastructure in exchange for influence, Tajikistan might just find itself swapping one big brother for another. In the long run, it's China, not the West, that seems poised to crowd Russia out of Tajikistan. Unlike the European Union, which focuses on green agendas, China uses financial muscle to gain political influence. And much like comparing a Prius to a tank, one might be better for the environment, but the other one can really easily bulldoze its way through. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Bruce Panier, a Central Asia Fellow, Foreign Policy Research Institute. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So we are looking at the situation in Tajikistan, and I've recently read a very intriguing article about how the Tajik president essentially lucked into his position and becoming in power for longer even than Vladimir Putin. Can you help us unfold that story a little bit?
Yeah. Imam Ali Rahman, in those days, in the early days, he was still called the Rahmanov. He dropped the Russian ending about 15 years ago. But he was elected in the Civil War, during the Civil War, at the start of the Civil War era in Tajikistan. Tajikistan had a civil war from 1992 to 1997. They went through two presidents in 1992. And in November, they decided to get rid of the second president. And they had an election in a town in the north of Tajikistan, and he was actually elected to be the Speaker of Parliament at the time, and they abolished the post of president. So he was de facto the head of the country at that time. And like I said, they were changing officials all the time during the Civil War. It was a very confusing time. In 1994, they finally decided to have a presidential election, and interestingly, a referendum on the Constitution to restore the office of the presidency to the Constitution. So he won the election, and of course the referendum passed, and there was an office of the president. So he became president in 1994. And, again, things were so tenuous during the Civil War era that I don't think very many people, for one, expected that he would last very long, because officials were coming and going all the time, and even the people that got him elected were part officials, government officials in the parliament, and part heads of local militias. They called themselves the Popular Front in those days, but they were pro-government militias that were fighting during the Civil War. And even some of them later would recall that they put him in because he was expendable. And they thought that if they needed to get rid of him, they would easily get rid of him. Well, it didn't work out that way. The peace deal was signed in 1997, and he has managed to retain power. He's been elected now, 4 times, I think, to be, and there's no sign that he's going to be ousted from his post or step down anytime in the near future.
So when we talk about people who are in power for such an extended amount of time, generally the consensus is that they start to kind of lose touch, as seen by Vladimir Putin, Lukashenko, for example. But Tajikistan is situated in a very peculiar situation where it does have to be relatively nimble, kind of juggling between all the powers around it. Do you think that the Tajik president will be able to kind of be flexible, or do you think he'll be complacent for having been there for so long?
Tajikistan is an interesting situation. The first thing I got to say is that the government has turned into a family-run business, right? So unless you know him, or he's got 9 children, right? So he's got 7 daughters, and their husbands are all wealthy businessmen, and his oldest son is the heir apparent and being groomed to fill the father's position. But what makes Tajikistan's situation unique is its location. The distance between the Afghan border and the Chinese border is only 60 kilometers, right? So, I mean, they're really close. Now, what Rahman has been able to do successfully for years is claim that he's the front line in the war on terrorism, and that if instability breaks out in Tajikistan, it'll spread through Central Asia, and it could spread into China. Now, those comments resonate really well in the international community. It's helped him get financial and military support from the West, from Russia, from China. He does certainly have to balance a little bit the relations. Like I said, he borders China. There's a Russian military base in Tajikistan, and Russia has always been probably the leading partner in Tajikistan, certainly in terms of security aid, other essentials such as petroleum, things like that. So he does have to balance those relations, but he has this card that he can play all the time, which he has done literally dozens of times, where he starts to say there's a huge group of militants massing on the border south of Tajikistan. If they come over, who knows, they could create an unstable situation in Tajikistan, and who knows what will happen from there. And of course, the international community, looking at what happened in Iraq, looking at what happened in Syria, looking at what happened in Libya, doesn't want to see a repeat of that scenario in Tajikistan. So he's ended up being the lesser of all the evils, because people basically think that he might not be the best leader, he might not be anything close to a democratic leader or even a competent leader, but we don't want instability in Tajikistan. And for now, he's able to keep the country stable.
Right, and like you mentioned, the international community kind of see him as the anchor of stability in the region. But how about domestically? Do people see it the same way? Does a term of, serving for 27 years give disdain for some of the Tajikistanis, as you mentioned, essentially it's being run like a family business?
Yeah, well, I can't stress that enough. It is run by a family business. Tajikistan is the poorest country in the Commonwealth of Independent States. And people, if you look at what's happening in the world today, there's a group, the Islamic State of Khorasan province, right? And they've been in the news a lot. They're staging attacks in all kinds of different countries. Now, curiously, or perhaps not so curiously, the agents of these attacks are often citizens of Tajikistan, because the situation in Tajikistan has gotten to be so bad. The government has eliminated any legitimate opposition, both secular and religious. They have total control over what's happening in the mosque. The standard of living is horrible, and there's no sign that it's going to get better anytime soon. The average wage in Tajikistan is less than $100 a month. Oof. So if you're living in Tajikistan and you're a young person and you've grown up there and gone through the education system, you have almost no hope at all of a better future. It's why so many Tajiks go as migrant laborers to Russia in recent years. Population's 10 million of Tajikistan, and more than 1 million Tajiks go to Russia. Or at least have been going to Russia to be migrant laborers. So it's not surprising when all of a sudden you find out that the attack in Iran at the start of the year, there was a Tajik citizen that was involved in that. The attacks at the Crocus City Hall in Moscow blamed on Tajik citizens. They've arrested some in Europe. They've arrested some in the United States, all Islamic State of Khorasan province. And you just have to attribute that to the fact that life is so hopeless in Tajikistan, especially knowing that the president's grooming his own son to take over for him. So it's not even a question of if we can just get through this president. It's a question of his son's going to get in, and we might be stuck with decades of the same form of rule in Tajikistan and the same socioeconomic situation. So it's really engendered this feeling of helplessness, and kind of contributed to a lot of these younger men in Tajikistan deciding they have nothing to lose by joining some of these radical groups.
All right, and I think hopeless and helplessness is a very key term that you mentioned here. As we know, a lot of countries are in a dire situation, but at least there's an international community that is attempting to make some sort of change. But again, like you mentioned, the international community seems to see the current Tajikistani regime as one of stability that wouldn't let any kind of conflict kind of brew over, which they are actually in favorable of the regime, however difficult it is for its population. So do you think that also adds to kind of the disenfranchisement of the Tajikistani population?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, it's the truth. Like I said, the unfortunate thing is, I said there's no hope for change because there's really no signs that there will be change. Tajikistan is too important to fail. The Tajik government, I should say, is too important to fail for too many major partners in the world. Like I said, West, China, they're all going to support this guy, and the people see that. So they understand that these countries will do whatever they can to keep him in power because they know him. They trust him enough to believe that he's going to be able to keep the country under control, and there won't be any instability in the breaking out in Tajikistan. It's not just a question of Tajikistan bordering China. It's a question of Tajikistan bordering the Xinjiang province of China, right? Which is where the Chinese say that are at least worried that they're going to have outbreaks of unrest. It's the big Muslim population, the Uyghurs, and they have this long-running campaign to crack down on them. So, China especially doesn't want to see someone like Rahman fall, and militant groups come in and create instability, because that's right on their border at that point, in an area, bordering an area that the Chinese already have serious doubts about, and are doing everything they can brutally to keep control of. So that would be a nightmare scenario for them, which is why it's not surprising that you see that China has actually established some very small, primitive, but all the same military or police. They call them, it's the People's Police of China, that are there. But they're essentially military bases, outposts that are inside Tajikistan, but near the Chinese border, and facing toward Afghanistan to make sure that no militants cross the border and end up in China. So, I mean, that's how important it is to China right now, that they've actually established it's kind of a small security presence in far eastern Tajikistan at the moment.
Right, and being in such a pivotal strategical position, it should, logically bring some benefits and some leverage that Tajikistan would have over these larger countries. But it doesn't seem like it has been leveraged well to benefit the country instead of just the regime itself. Is that the case?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's such an interesting situation that's happening there. When Vladimir Putin was the prime minister of Russia, between his presidential terms, he was the prime minister, and President Rahman, and this is of course through the grapevine. So there's no video or audio recording of this, but it was well reported or widely reported at the time, that Putin said, Rahman said, "I'm going to put my son in charge when I leave. He's going to take over my place." And Putin warned him that Russia could replace him with somebody else anytime they wanted to. So, again, in some cases that they want stability. A lot of countries want stability in Tajikistan. But if you could put your guy in there and you thought that he would maintain stability in Tajikistan, it's not inconceivable that a country like Russia, or possibly even China, would work against Rahman to put in their own person if they were very confident that person could just step right into the job and keep the same kind of control over the country that Rahman has been keeping over the country for the last 25 years.
All right. Thank you so much for your input and insight and helping us dissect this situation. Thanks again for being with us on Eastern Express. Appreciate it.
Always a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Bruce. And now we move on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. Russian occupying forces have repaired the destroyed railway in occupied Mariupol, thus significantly reducing the logistic route for the Russian military by nearly 300 kilometers. This new route is likely to become crucial for Russian military logistics, which rely heavily on rail for transporting troops and heavy weaponry.
In recent months, Russian supplies have depended on the Kerch Bridge linking Russia to Crimea and railway ferries in the Kerch Strait. On July 31st, the Mariupol railway station was reopened after its complete destruction, initially serving civilians with a diesel train commuting between Mariupol and Volnovakha. Freight trains are expected to commence operations soon, providing an alternative to the Kerch Strait Bridge for supplying Russian forces in southern Ukraine. Mariupol has been under Russian occupation since February 2022, following the beginning of Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
The European Union has sanctioned 28 Belarusian individuals for their roles and participating in the ongoing internal repression and human rights violations in Belarus. The newly imposed sanctions target judiciary members responsible for politically motivated sentences against democratic activists.
The sanctions list, now covering 261 individuals and 37 entities, also includes Lukashenko's supporters, state media figures and members of the Belarusian Youth Council. These individuals face EU asset freezes, travel bans and prohibitions on EU citizens and companies from providing them with funds. The list also includes 2 deputy chiefs from the Interior Ministry's office, which is known for political persecution, unlawful arrests and torture of activists. Since the rigged 2020 presidential election, tens of thousands of Belarusians have faced severe political repression, with most notable opposition leaders arrested or exiled.
The Bulgarian parliamentary group, There Is Such a People, has returned to its third mandate to form a government to the country's president, Rumen Radev. Consequently, new early parliamentary elections are likely to be scheduled in the country in October 6th or October 13th, continuing Bulgaria's struggle with governmental instability.
The leader of There Is Such a People party has confirmed that after a week of negotiations with various political factions, his grouping failed to secure the necessary 121 MPs to form a government. It had managed to garner support from a total of 66 MPs. Others, however, did not back their cabinet. Previously, the party's minority government proposal was also unsuccessful, as was its last coalition proposition. President Radev now has 2 months to appoint a caretaker government and set the election date, expected to be in October, marking the 7th parliamentary elections in Bulgaria in just 3 years.
Archbishop Bagrat Galstanian, leader of Armenia's recent anti-government protests, has vowed renewed efforts to oust Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan. He is rallying support across Armenian towns and villages following a widespread police protest crackdown in June.
Prime Minister Pashinyan is heavily accused of making territorial concessions to Azerbaijan. Galstanian has labeled him a bloodthirsty antichrist and indicated a change in protesting tactics to avoid further violence. He plans to resume active campaigns for Pashinyan's resignation in early September. Despite local claims that his movement has lost momentum, Galstanian insists support is growing, both domestically and internationally. Pashinyan, meanwhile, continues his own regional tours, garnering support in many local communities. His allies dismiss Galstanian's movement as insignificant, with lawmakers calling it based on lies and not a cause for concern.
And that's all for this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.